Hello and welcome to In the Light. I'm Anna Isabel, and with me today is Michael Rhodes, who is known by many as a modern mystic. And Michael, firstly, I want to say thank you and welcome for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
I really wanted to talk to you because I first came across you when I was doing Lightways for My Spirit Radio. And the very first book, which is called Conscious Gardening, and I
Really?
absolutely loved it. Yeah, that's the first one. I know you've written so many, but that's the one that I first read. And I I really fell in love with it because it was about your connection with nature. And so I think maybe that would be a really nice place to start with you.
Mhm.
Could you tell us a little bit about how it is that you began to discover this connection and where it's led you?
Well, that's quite a story. Where it began was probably the very first, as I wrote in the book at the beginning, the very first thing, my real connection with nature. I was about 6 years old, and my father brought home 12 tomato plants, and he gave me six, and he kept six for himself. And so we set his six in one group, and mine or in one row, and mine in another row. And about 2 weeks later, his were looking good and mine were looking pretty sick. And another 2 weeks after that, mine were going yellow and his were growing green and robust. And I told him one day how unhappy I was that all my tomato plants were dying. And he came and had a look at them and he said, "Well, that's very strange. I don't know why this would happen." And I said, I was crying. I find it horrible. Every day I dig them up and look at the roots, and they're not growing. And then he laughed. He said, "You dig them up and look at the roots?" I said, "Yes, and they're not growing." And so he told me, "You don't dig them up. You look at the roots. You just leave them in the ground, and you trust." And that was also one of my first connections with trust. Leave them and you trust that they will grow. You give them water if they need it. And so my tomatoes finally recovered from their nightly assault of being dug up. And I eventually got tomatoes that came when his were finishing, mine were just starting. And I was completely amazed at these lovely, delicious tomatoes that came from just by putting a plant in the ground and trusting.
You learned about faith through gardening.
You could call it faith, I call it trust. But then there were other incidents that I developed a passionate interest in the garden. And by the time I was 10, in fact, 9, nearly at 8, but by the time I was 9, I had a collection of about 200 pot plants, or shall I say in these days, plants in pots. And I knew the botanical name of all of them and their requirements. I knew how to care for them all, their horticulture requirements. And so one day I was with a friend of mine. We were cycling home from school. And as we went down Union Lane in Cambridge, it wouldn't be there now, he called in to see his great aunt that day. So we went into her terraced home and out into her terrace garden because that's where she was. Now, I'd been there before and it fascinated me because the walls each side of the terrace garden would probably be about 6'6", something like that. The average person couldn't look over them. To me, they looked very high, but they were probably just about 6', 6'6". Anyway, and on each side of her garden, there were trees. And so her garden was in almost permanent shade. But every time I went there, everything was flowering. I couldn't understand it because I knew at 9 that the flowering for most plants, flowers are a response to the sun. If you want roses, 10 or 12 hours sun a day. If you want water lilies, full sun all day, and so on. And there are many specialized plants that don't need that. but most of them definitely require the sun, and certainly hers did, and yet they flowered without the sun. And so I had a suspicion, but on her birthday, which she was 90, she asked us if we would like a glass of sherry, Richard and I. And so at 9, very exciting to have my first glass of sherry. And so I drank down the sherry, and I think it gave me some Dutch courage, because then I asked her, could you tell me, do you love your plants? And I was frightened to ask this because it's so crazy. And but I did. And she looked at me and she said, oh my, yes, I do. I love my plants and garden. And in that moment, I had one of those, what we were just talking about, an intuitive, an insight, a moment where everything connected. And I suddenly realized that in the garden, she with her love, she was the sun. And that, I never forgot it. She was the sun in her garden. And I knew in that moment, you can have rules and guidelines, but once you become the sun in your garden and all your plants, once you're that connected, all the rules you can put aside. You've moved into a completely different space. And I realized that at 9, and that had a big part to play in my life.
I'm sitting here and I'm listening, and I think that is just so beautiful, because it is this idea of that energy that she's putting in. She's putting in her focus. She's caring about them. And it makes me think a little bit about my allotment, because, some would say it's fanciful, but I do have a sense that when I arrive, my little plot knows it's me.
Of course, absolutely. Anybody who thinks otherwise is what I'd call a subconscious, disconnected person. The more conscious you are on your allotment, the more conscious you are when you get there. In other words, in the moment and not lost in thoughts, the more you connect with the spirit of the land.
And that's what excited me so much when I read your book, was this idea that I could actually have more than, you see, because for most gardeners and for many people who love being out in nature and who connect with animals, it's a given that you enjoy being there, and that you want it to thrive, and you want it to do well. So that's there. But this is about having personal connection to the plants and the land. Would you say that that's a way of seeing it?
That's the name of the book, Conscious Gardening. And that's the name of what you were doing. You were consciously connecting. And that transcends enjoyment and pleasure. It connects you with the spirit of the land. Even your allotment, if you go there regularly and you work on it and you connect with it, it attracts what we would call a deva, which is an area, an energy, like an overlighting nature spirit that would be there at the allotment waiting for you, because it lives in a timeless realm. It doesn't live in linear time. It lives in spherical time, where all time occupies the same moment. It's on a higher frequency than we are, but it's there and connects. And when you're conscious, and you can communicate with it and be conscious with it, and you will grow things like it's in a completely different way because you're connected. That is incredibly rare, Anna. Most people never connect.
No, and that's something that I really am consciously trying to cultivate. And I'm so excited as we're speaking, because only last week I decided that I would start having my meditation on my allotment. And I decided that precisely because I wanted to see where it could take me in connecting with my plot. So this is a big adventure for me.
That's wonderful, Anna. When you're sitting meditating, just imagine a sphere of light that you are. You are a magnificent, metaphysical, multidimensional, eternal being of love and light. Love, the power of creation, light, the light of creation. And so you're this being. And so when you're meditating, expand your light out. And so it completely fills your allotment, completely fills it. You'll find that the soil life will thrive better. You will never have insect pests. I mean, I don't even know what they are in my garden. You won't have insect pests. Everything will move into a completely different relationship with you and therefore with the world. And it's a wonderful way to garden. And that's the place where you could, what people would call miracles happen. Miracles only happen when you're consciously in the moment. So although miracles are all around most people, they never see them because they're not there. They're thinking, and you think your way out of the moment.
I guess, again, as I'm listening to you, not everyone has a garden, but if you've got houseplants, you could certainly do this experiment too, because it's the same principle.
Absolutely the same. Houseplants or even the local park. It doesn't belong to anybody any more than your own garden or your own house belongs to it. You have the right to live in it for as long as you live. And when you've gone, it's still there. The land is still there. And although we play stupid games of ownership, nobody has ever owned the land. They've only owned the right to live there. And so when you let that ownership thing go, you can walk in a park and it's yours and it's you. And you can fill it with your own love light. And it will relate to you and connect with you, every tree. So there's no limits on this. There's one little story I'd like to tell you. And incidentally, that wasn't my grandmother. That was my friend Richard's great aunt. My grandmother didn't have much love in her, I'm afraid.
Oh.
But one little story about what you would call connection. When I was in Tasmania, I lived there for about 12 years, and I became fairly well known, and I was invited on to 7LA, Launceston 7LA radio. And I became very good friends with James Stark. And so we did a weekly or bi-weekly program. And on one of those programs, I invited everybody who would like to talk to us about communicating with nature and their results. And so this woman, a lot of people phoned in, but one really amazing story. This woman, she lived in a house, and in the front back garden was an apple tree. And she said they had had it 20 years. And she said, all my husband and I, we used to put up with it. And every year we put up with it because it flowered beautifully, but we never, ever got a single apple from it. They always fell off. And she said, a few years ago, my husband died, and in the garden shed, there's an old axe. And she said, this last year, she said, not this year, last year, she said, I thought to myself, I've had enough of this. Now, this is about communicating from a place of clarity and purpose and intent, which we don't. We're generally wishy-washy. And so she went down to the shed, she told us, and she said, she described herself, I'm a little old lady. We laughed. And she said she got her late husband's axe, and she couldn't carry it. It was too heavy. So she dragged it across the garden until she got to the apple tree. And she said to the apple tree, do you see this axe? I am fed up with you. You'll never give me apples. If you don't give me apples this year, I'm going to chop you down if it takes me a month to do it. We burst out laughing listening to this little old lady who couldn't even carry the axe. And she said, you might laugh, young man, but she said, the simple fact is I had 2 barrow loads of apples off my apple tree last year for the first time ever. And she said, this spring, when it was in flower, I went down to it and she said, do you remember what I told you last year? Well, the same applies to this year, which is completely ridiculous. And we laughed again. And she said, you can laugh. She said, it's covered in green apples. And so, the question is, how does this work? And so she's deeply connected. She'd lived there for a long time. She tolerated the apple tree, but she wanted apples. And we are the creative energy, of the evolution of consciousness. Nature is a natural evolution of consciousness. We're the creative. And so she exerted without having a clue what she was doing, because the tree didn't understand a word she said, but her energy clearly communicated to the energy of the tree. If I get no apples this year, I will chop you down. The tree had no clue whether she could do that or not. So it's a communication of human consciousness with apple tree consciousness. And I could tell you many such instances. It sounds like a story, a fairy story. It's absolutely true.
The word love keeps cropping up, and it's the second book which I read of yours. It's actually book 3, but it was Through the Eyes of Love, Journeying with Pan. And I think we, just by talking about the relationship with nature, we have been talking about the essence of this, which is that love energy. And one of the things that I loved about the book was how you talked about, because I had not the power of meditating on love itself. So tell us a little bit about that, please, Michael.
Well, I'm not quite sure how you've said that, the power of meditation on love itself. But let's just talk about this. When I'm talking about love, I'm talking about unconditional love. And love, this is a rather sad piece of this. Today, like Bruce Lipton and people of that caliber believe that about 94% of humanity lives subconsciously. And where this gets, you can begin to see why we have the crisis in humanity today, is because there is no such thing as subconscious love. And so we have taken our higher emotions and we call them love, which is like saying the lower emotions are fear. If you get in a car, you don't become a car, you're a passenger in a car. And so if you meet a dog that you love, a person that you love, a man or woman that you love, a friend that you love, and your emotions rise, then you're now in higher emotions. And we call that love. But it isn't. Love is the power of creation. And so the higher emotions are the passenger of love, just as the lower emotions are the passenger of fear. Fear is not the opposite of love, because love has no opposite, which is ironic, because humanity at this stage now, for so many people, are the opposition to love. So the only love there is the love, the power of creation. So when you're feeling unconditional love for yourself, you are now connected with the love, the power of creation. And love begins to recreate you in its own image. And it's rather like, to describe it, it's rather like, and this is, somewhere along your way down the track of your spiritual journeying. I don't like the word path, but there you go. There's no path, but there's no people. So we'll leave the illusions out. And so when you find the way to unconditionally love yourself, a good way to explain that is unconditional self-acceptance, unconditional self-trust. When you have put those two in place, you are expressing unconditional self-love, because love is an ambiguous word that we do not understand. And as soon as we try to put words to it to understand it, that is not love. That is an intellectual explanation of love. And the internet never experiences love. So it can't actually do that. But that's what we've become, intellectual people. And so love, when you feel this unconditional love for yourself, life becomes effortless. There is no longer effort in everything. You're no longer criticizing. I never criticize myself. I don't judge myself. I don't experience anxiety or stress or worry. I don't get angry. And those things have all gone. And so you live in like a stress-free zone. And as you live this way, it's as though your life unfolds in a way of a dance. And although there is no music to listen to, somehow throughout your whole beingness, and we're not just talking physical body, throughout your being, there's like a resonance and a frequency that you feel as a form, like the music of the spheres, if you say, like a universal music, and yet it isn't music, but you can feel it. And life becomes a dance, and you dance to this music, and there's no rhyme, there's no steps. It's just how somehow, as you flow with life, it's like you're moving in a dance through life, and life is dancing with you. And one day, indeed, you realize that you have a dancing partner. It doesn't come suddenly. It grows out of this experience, and you realize you have this dancing partner. And gradually you realize that your dancing partner is love. And so you dance with love, loving yourself, loving your life, loving where you are, loving who you're with, loving humanity. It doesn't mean you approve of everything humanity does or says, but humanity are souls, and you're loving those souls, even though this is a kindergarten planet and those souls are young. You're just loving everything. Everything is love. And gradually you begin to realize that as you dance, love is transforming self. The being you are is transforming self into its own image. And you surrender to this, it's fine. And then eventually you all realize with a shock that self, this is not personality, identity, or body, but the self you are is also transforming, changing, and recreating love into the image of self. And gradually, as the love changes you to love, and you change love to self, gradually you create something that is utterly and totally unique, that every human who does this is completely unique, which I often describe as the growth of God, which today I would describe as the growth of supreme creation. And so supreme creation keeps expanding the universe, and all that is keeps expanding, much to the quandary of some of the narrow-minded scientists.
So I think this is exactly what I was talking about, and I found it tremendously exciting when I was reading your book, and I read, this is one of the reasons why I so wanted to talk to you today, because I want everyone to have the opportunity to experience the joy of doing this, which is what I aim for when I'm meditating, is having that energy moving in that direction. So what can people do to learn how to do this? Well, the good news is you've got some online courses going, and it would be nice if you could tell us a little bit about them.
Well, the online courses are designed, and this will be ongoing. The Great Awakening will come to an end, and we will continue. We created two platforms, the Great Awakening platform and the Michael Rhodes Teaching online platform. And so through these two platforms, we will continue on indefinitely, expanding and growing. And so the picture, the online course is like the preliminary to how it will continue. So in this preliminary, I discuss love, unconditional love. I discuss unconditional trust. I talk about the emotional bodies, the mental bodies, and how to heal the lower of these bodies, which people are already into. You can always join, because you will get recordings of everything that's happened so far. And then there are questions and answer sessions. And so the whole thing is to help people move out of the illusion into the deeper truth of life, of who you are. You know, we believe that we are a body, personality with a soul. Nothing could be more wrong. We are an eternal soul with a temporary body personality. They come and go. And yet the average person spends 99% of their life focused on the body personality and the mental. So we get intellectual and clever. Nobody gives any energy to the emotions, and yet the emotions are our powerhouse. And so long ago, I decided I would do it differently. So I give about 60% of my focus to the body, personality, and emotional mental self. And then I give about 40% to the metaphysical being I am, the eternal being. So I look at things through the eyes of a greater reality. I really don't look at life much now through consensus reality. When I look at the news and I realize the rubbish they put on, it's just to manipulate people's minds into believing certain things. And they're doing it very powerfully at the moment. And so these are things I'm talking about to allow a person to emerge from to realize maybe they're a caterpillar that is about ready to go into a cocoon, and how to move to surrender to that cocoon process and to the transmutation that takes place in the cocoon, and to come out on the other side with human wings of light to fly into a higher realms of expression and being. This is very much the caterpillar world at this stage. And if you were to ask me, I would say 80% will probably carry on as caterpillars into another cycle, which is not wrong or bad or anything like that, or failure or anything. And about 20% will move into their wings of light and will continue into an arena of newness. And that doesn't make them successful. It simply means they've given more energy to being conscious and to their spiritual growth. Others have given most of their energy to survival, to money and material things. And neither is right nor wrong, and there's no criticism implied. But this is like the end of a long, long term in class. 200,000 years has come to an end, is wrapping up. And so every human being on the soul level is already deciding their journey. And I won't comment too much on that in these particular times, but that's the way it's happening now. And so the whole idea of the online course is to give people a basis on which to stand to move through this whole process that humanity is going through right now. And for most of humanity, by not choosing anything, they choose self-denial. And when I say self, I mean the greater self. And they will continue on with the personality self. And this isn't bad or wrong. It's just that we're moving in the directions our last 200,000 years of incarnations have taken us. And there had to be a point where, even though everything remains as one human consciousness, there is now a time of apartness when we move onto different paths. And like I say, there's no judgment in this, there's no comparison. It's just like in a normal classroom, you do a year, and if you misbehave, then the rest of the class goes on and you haven't learned much, and you have to repeat that class again next year. Well, for this 200-year class, it's like the very few move on and the very many got lost in the reason why they're in that classroom and completely lost it. And so we'll have to do it again to maybe reconnect with the reason and their purpose of being. Because it puzzles me that most people never ask themselves, what is my purpose of being? Why am I here? Who am I? What am I? what is this all about? And no church has ever had the answer, and no religion has the answer either. They have no more idea than the people who go there. In fact, I'll say it, religion was a device to separate the human being from their divinity. And a spiritually focused person is connecting with their divinity, whereas religion puts a priest or a bishop or whatever in between, so you now have the separation of the human from God. And this was done deliberately, and it's had incredible repercussions. But, a lot of your people will not believe this, and that's fine. There's a timing to truth. And if it's not their timing, that's fine. And if it is, well, good, more power to you.
Well, if you would like to learn more about how you can move towards getting your wings of light, the place to go is michaelrhodes.com, and you will learn more about how to take part in these wonderful new courses.
I'd like to add, if you put in michaelrhodes.online, then you will go directly into the Great Awakening and the others, and you can read about them and learn directly there.
Brilliant. So that's michaelrhodes.online. And I will put both links in the notes to this podcast, along with something else, because earlier we did another interview, which will be featured on YouTube, and in which you get the opportunity to learn more about Michael and his birth chart.
I learned some about myself.
And so you can learn more about Michael and perhaps a little bit about astrology on the YouTube link, which I'm going to put also on these notes. Michael, once again, thank you so much for joining us today on In the Light.
And thank you very much, Anna, for having me in the light.